When Sarah Collins's alarm went off at 6:30 a.m., the sun had just begun to rise over Atlanta. She wasn't. They had to be in court until 9 a.m., but her years as a federal lawyer had taught her how important it was to case files, to show how organized she was by showing up in her small but beautiful downtown Atlanta apartment. Her court clothes were always ready the night before, neatly stacked on her home office desk, but today was different. Sarah was not going to the federal courts where people usually took her seriously as an assistant U.S. attorney. Instead, she had to appear in municipal court to address a straightforward personal issue, a disputed parking ticket. She chose to dress less formally than usual, opting for a clean navy blue jacket over a white shirt, which she believed was a mistake. She was dressed in a black shirt and black pants. Sarah carefully pinned back her natural hair as she stood in front of her bathroom mirror. She had recently begun to wear it with pride, having spent years fixing it at the age of 35. The drive on her face was clear. That helped her finish Howard Law School at the top of her class and get a prestigious job at the U.S. Attorney's Office. She is carrying a banana and a travel mug filled with fresh coffee in her Mercedes, which she recently purchased as a reward for winning a significant race. A fraud case was waiting in the parking basement. She took great pride in her car. People would react with amusement when they saw a young black woman exiting such an expensive car. Traffic was moving slowly through downtown Atlanta in the morning, but Sarah wasn't afraid because she had plenty of time. She turned on NPR and listened to the morning edition as she prepared for the 9 a.m. meeting. News. She was going over her paperwork for the parking ticket argument in her head. The ticket had been given in A. At 8:15 a.m., she parked her car at a spot where the signs indicated different things, and she had pictures to prove it. The Bluetooth system told her she had a call, and the screen showed it was from her boss, the U.S. attorney himself. Her heart beat faster when she got a straight call from him, which generally meant something important. "We had a problem with the Thompsons, and I'm sorry for the early call." Her boss's voice came through the speakers. "Case of trafficking. The defense just filed a last-minute move that could stop our pursuit. I need your help." Sarah tightened her grip on the driving wheel as soon as she saw this. It was one of the biggest cases of trafficking in Georgia's history, of course. "What's the timeline?" As promised, the judge gave us until noon to reply. "I've sent the papers to your email address. Please look them over. Come back to me with your analysis, please." "Yes, sir." Sarah did react properly. Her mind was already racing due to her 8:30 a.m. parking appointment. She was allowing herself ample time to locate the correct parking spot. Now she has to find a place to stop and look over these important documents. Papers. Sarah managed to secure a parking space at a nearby small coffee shop. She took out her laptop, hooked it up to her phone's hotspot, and started reading the defense's move and the legal points. Were hard to understand, and she found herself taking careful notes. Time passed as she carefully considered each point, determined to understand them and give detailed comments. When she finally checked her watch, it read 8:50 a.m., which made her heart sink. The court wasn't open for another 10 minutes, and Sarah knew it would take some time to find a parking spot. She quickly called her boss back. Sarah discussed her findings and proposed a more comprehensive review during her next traffic court date. She had never been late to court before, so she knew how to stay cool. It was against everything she believed in, but she knew her job. As a federal lawyer, I had duties that I couldn't ignore. The Thompson case could potentially impact me. Dozens of lives, and the move that morning could have an effect on the whole case she finally got involved with. She arrived at the municipal court parking lot at 9:10 a.m. As she ran toward the building, a thank you message rang on her phone. Sarah let out a small smile when she got a note from her boss saying that her quick analysis had been very helpful. At least the wait had been worthwhile, something she was unaware of as she hurried up the courthouse steps. There was proof that her slightly late arrival was about to set off a chain of events that would demonstrate Dee's bias within the system, despite dedicating her entire life to enhancing Judge William Barrett's. Judge William Barrett met her in the courtroom, transforming what had been an ordinary morning into something extraordinary. At 62 years old, the courtroom was known for having tight rules and being cold. Despite his advanced age, greying hair, and wire-rimmed glasses, he exuded a confidence that stemmed from his 30 years of professional experience. Monday morning, he sat on the bench above everyone else, his black robe pressed and perfect, and watched as a lot of people came into his classroom at 9 a.m. The local courtroom was already filled with 23 people. Many of them were there to resolve minor issues such as parking tickets, driving issues, and minor disagreements. Judge Barrett saw that most of the people who got there early were dressed in white and carrying their papers. He gave them a thumbs up for being on time and making sure everything was organized and ready. Right on time at 9 a.m., Judge Barrett resumed his regular schedule by calling the first few cases for practice. He took pride in the swiftness and efficiency of his courts, akin to a well-functioning machine. Being late, he thought, was a sign of trouble. When Sarah broke the rules at 9:15 a.m., the door to the hall opened. Collins walked in quietly, hoping not to make a fuss, but Judge Barrett stopped the proceedings right away in the middle of a statement. During another case, he squinted his eyes in response to the interruption, focusing on the black woman who had the courage to enter his court. He told them to take a step forward in a cold and sharp voice. The other case was Sarah walked to the stage with a straight back and a professional attitude, even though the crowd was hostile. At the front desk, Judge Barrett looked down at his notebook and said, "You must be Sarah Collins." It was planned for 9 a.m. He stressed the time in a tone that was dripping with disapproval. "Do you think your time is—" The time the judge spent with Miss Collins before Sarah could provide an explanation was more beneficial. Barrett continued to speak, his voice growing louder with each line intended to show her and a few others in the room. People in the courtroom had moved around in their seats awkwardly earlier. A white businessman arrived 5 minutes behind schedule, and the judge had hardly noticed that we have rules in this courtroom, Judge Barrett told them. He shuffles papers on his desk without glancing at Sarah. "This isn't a casual gathering in the neighborhood. Just come in whenever you want. This is a court of law." Sarah stood still at the platform with her hands folded in front of her. She saw that the judge hadn't even looked at her qualifications or paperwork. His assumptions were evident on his face, as she could discern from the way his eyes scrutinized her business attire. He talked to her like she was a child. An older black man is named James Wilson. As he watched the scene, his worry grew. In his 15 years in this courtroom, he had seen this routine happen many times. Before he briefly caught Sarah's eye, he gave her a look that said, "Your Honor, if I may." Just to be clear, Sarah's voice was calm and professional at the start. "You shouldn't judge Barrett. I've heard every possible reason for car trouble, traffic, and personal issues. The situation doesn't matter. The time was set for 9 a.m. He took it up. He held his gavel as if its mere appearance would make the other people waiting for their cases more aware of how powerful he was. Those there at 9:10 a.m. paid close attention to a young white woman, kept her still. Late arrivals that weren't dealt with at all. A trend was becoming clear to everyone in the courtroom. Even Judge Barr himself didn't seem to notice it. "This court won't stand for such a lack of respect for the rules," Judge Barr said. Sarah's calm demeanor challenged his authority, causing his face to flush slightly. "Maybe a fine will help you. Remember how important it is to be on time." Sarah stood her ground and kept her cool. She had previously dealt with prejudice in her work, but this instance was unique. This was a clear case of power abuse in real life. The chamber became more tense as she faced witnesses in the system she had sworn to protect. The other suspects watched the middle-aged court clerk who had worked with them, with a mixture of pity and worry. For years, Judge Barrett looked more and more uncomfortable as she typed the case into her computer. As Judge Barrett prepared to deliver his sentence, he had no idea that his words would trigger a series of events. A series of events unfolded, testing not only his authority, but also the system's ability to ensure equal justice. Still to come was the morning's real surprise: the law. Judge Barrett leaned forward in his high-backed chair. Stern's face was on the leather chair as he got ready to give his sentence. The morning sun shone through the window. The tall courtroom windows harshly lit his face, making him appear even more intimidating than usual. Collins said in a voice that echoed through the now empty courtroom, "This court fines you $500 for contempt." He paused to let the amount sink in. It was one of the biggest fines he had ever given for being late this year. But without mentioning this, Sarah stood motionless at the platform, quickly jotting down all the details of what had transpired. During their conversation, she noticed that the judge's eyes never quite met hers, and his voice had a distinct edge. She had heard too many stories in her role as a federal lawyer to have a sixth sense for recognizing people. When Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk, entered the fee into the system, bias was disguised as authority. She hesitantly touched the computer system and said, "I've been keeping records in this courtroom for 12 years and something." She felt awful enough about this situation that she made a separate note in her personal log just to vent. Earlier this week, a white male lawyer showed up 20 minutes late with no reason and saw only Despite the vocal warning, Judge Barrett persisted, seemingly under pressure. Sarah's silence allowed him to learn a lesson in duty, and he removed a sheet of paper and pretended to read from it, even though it was clear that it was only for show. This shows that the court system works properly. Without respect and punctuality, there is chaos in the hall. Different suspects experienced varying emotions when they witnessed a young white woman in a business suit checking her watch. An old black man shook his head as he thought about how she had also been late and not heard anything from the judge. I scratched my head a little, as I had seen this scene far too many times before. When James Wilson was a judge, he kept his professional stance, but his jaw got noticeably tighter over the years. He remembered these kinds of things, even though he never talked about them. Today's fine the intensity was significantly higher than usual, and it all seemed to occur at an inconvenient time. Sarah took a slow, intentional breath. In her last breath, she had dealt with a huge number of cases in federal court, charged dangerous crooks, and fought the hardened defense. Your case was personal, but it also represented something greater than herself: lawyers. With excellent care, she took out her phone and quickly wrote down the exact time and amount of the fine. It was Judge Barrett's job to make sure people followed the rules. "You'll pay this fine before you leave the courts today. Wouldn't want you to be late with that either." A few worried laughs came from the crowd, but they were quickly stopped by there was strain in the air, and the sun had moved, now shining on Sarah's face. Standing at the platform, her face remained serious, yet her eyes displayed a resolve that would have made a difference. Judge Poore was more knowledgeable due to her years of experience in building cases through the collection and analysis of information. She was looking for justice, and Judge Barrett was giving her every reason to demonstrate that his bench was biased in a systematic manner. "Do you understand the fine as I've described it, Judge?" Barrett's question seemed to imply that he was anticipating Meek's affirmative response. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was calm and clear. "Yes, sir." She fully understood every word. Her tone of voice didn't show any of the ideas that she had learned. "I learned a long time ago that writing down everything and waiting for the right time was sometimes the best thing to do." The judge nodded, pleased with what he saw as submission to his power. He then moved on to the next case. He had the file on his desk and was ready to move on, as if he hadn't shown the prosecution's friendly bias. He was unaware that Sarah was meticulously recording his words, his tone, and his distinct expressions of the accused. He didn't see her quickly type a message to her office, and he had no idea what his next move would be. A much larger argument about justice and authority was about to use a few moments of claimed authority as proof of justice for everyone in the courts. As Judge Barrett prepared to move on to the next case, the audience remained rapt. She wasn't done. She was just getting started. What would happen in the next few minutes would shake Judge to its core. Barrett was in charge of his world, and he didn't even see it coming when Sarah Collins opened her door. The mood in the courtroom changed when she pulled out a leather badge holder with gold accents. The federal seal caught the eye of Judge Barrett in the morning light. He was already thinking about the next case. He thought their conversation was over, but, Your Honor, Sarah's voice told him it wasn't. She carried a new authority that made everyone in the courtroom stop and think. Before proceeding, I must provide a proper introduction. Just so you know, she held up her gold badge from the U.S. Department of Justice for me to see. Hello, my name is Sarah Collins, and I'm an assistant U.S. attorney working in the Northern District of Georgia right now. The result happened right away and was very dramatic. Just moments before, Judge Barrett's face had been red with power. Out of color, he reached for the next case file, but his hand stopped in mid-air. The silence in the courtroom was so profound that even the normally quiet old ceiling fans suddenly seemed loud. Mrs. Thompson and the court. The clerk stopped typing in the middle of a sentence, her fingers still on the computer. James Wilson couldn't help but smile a little. He had seen a lot in this courtroom, but this moment would be one he would never forget. I judge Barrett for starting and stopping for the first time in years to come. That morning, he really looked at Sarah. He saw more than just her race or gender. He also saw how she worked. I'm sorry for her behavior, her perfectly fitted blazer, and most importantly, the federal ID in her hand. Despite my tardiness this morning, Sarah maintained a steady and clear voice. I was late due to an important government meeting. The Thompson human trafficking trial, which I'm sure you're familiar with, is a case that needs instant detention. She paused to let the weight of her words sink in. With the news I have, I'm pleased to give the court written proof of this from the U.S. Attorney's Office, the young white man said. A woman who got there late sank lower in her seat as she watched what seemed like a scene from an illegal play. An old black man in the gallery sat up straighter, and a proud look crossed his face. This was what he had been waiting for. It took decades to see Judge Barrett's mouth open and close several times before he found his words. Collins. I shuffled the papers on his desk and suddenly felt much smaller in his presence. Raised chair. Had I known your position, I would have known mine, Sarah said strongly. But what matters is that the law treated her equally, regardless of her honor. She stepped away from the podium and took out her phone. I have documented several troubling patterns this morning, she said. Processes such as how suspects were treated differently based on their race and how important the judge thought they were. His face paled to a green tint. As a local court judge, he was fully aware of the difficulties a federal court could present. The prosecutor's mind raced back over what had happened in the morning, and all of a sudden he saw the whole thing through. With fresh eyes, he might have swiftly suggested that we could discuss this matter in chambers. Of course, the fine is waived, but, Your Honor, Sarah answered, her voice carrying the weight of every discrimination case she faced in her job. The fine shouldn't be thrown out just because of I'm not taking a stand that would make the structural unfairness I'm talking about worse. I think this is a chance to talk about fair treatment under the law in a more general way. Others in the courtroom were shocked as they watched. Many of them were caught with their phones out, a violation of the rules. They would record this kind of moment and tell their children about the day someone finally stood up and named all of them had felt unfair treatment. But Mrs. Thompson was now typing faster than ever to show it, so she could write down every word of this important conversation. She had witnessed Judge Barrett reprimand numerous inmates. Over the years, she had never seen him face such a strong and clear threat to his authority as she did that morning. The sun now filled the whole courtroom, shining like a spotlight on Judge Barrett as he sat in his chair. Sarah Collins stood tall at the stage, transitioning from an accuser to a suspect. The words that followed in this courtroom would transform him into a fervent advocate for justice in full view of all. The simple case of a parking ticket escalates into a change that impacts the entire court system. Following Sarah Collins's death, there was an unavoidable moment of reckoning. In Judge Barrett's courtroom, revelation happened like an explosion in slow motion. The judge's first attempt to backtrack was clear to everyone there. He moved papers on his desk and cleared his throat several times. He adjusted his reading glasses to hide all the signs that he was getting more uncomfortable. Collins Judge Barrett said, "My voice is noticeably softer than it was before. Let me be the first to say I'm sorry for this." He accidentally pressed the button to call his clerk, resulting in an error. "We will remove this fine from the record." Sarah immediately stood at the stage, maintaining a straight back and a professional voice. "Your Honor," she said. With a strong yet controlled voice, I politely declined the removal of the fine. Her words caused murmurs throughout instead of focusing on the bench, I'd like to discuss the larger issue that the other suspects were facing. Moving forward in their seats, Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk, had quit typing altogether. As she watched the scene play out, her fingers froze over the keyboard. James Wilson took a step towards her. In the middle of the courtroom, Sarah kept pulling away because she could feel how important this moment was in history. "I saw 7 people come into this courtroom after 9 a.m. on her phone, where she had been taking notes. Time to begin. 3 of those 7 were white pros who didn't get a word or a warning from the bench. To help you understand, 2 of the kids who were verbally warned were Asian, and the other 2 were black." Judge Barrett's face turned red as he thought about who got the worst treatment. Again, but this time it was because she was embarrassed instead of being told what to do. "Collins, you're making some very serious claims." His voice trembled slightly, "but I assure you that this is not the case. The data shows that the court doesn't treat everyone the same, Your Honor," Sarah quietly replied, then turned slightly to address the entire courtroom. "I've already sent a full report to my office. As a federal court officer, it's my job to report any trends of unfair treatment of people with disabilities in our court system." A young law student stands at the back of the courtroom, quickly scribbled notes. This was the kind of real-life law drama that an old black man couldn't have learned from a book. A man who had been watching earlier wiped a tear from his eye as he reflected on similar experiences he had had over the years. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Judge Barrett TA asked. "The public's trust in the justice system is falling faster and faster." The morning sun through the windows felt like it squished his face. Sarah put both hands on the platform. With a clear and determined voice, "I urge you to take 3 instant steps, Your Honor. I'll pay the $500 fine not because it's fair, but because it will help me learn." She held up a second finger as proof of what had happened today. "Please review the disrespect charges and fines issued in this hearing over the past 6 months. Trends in population growth. The The judge's face turned pale as she spoke. And third, I propose requiring all court employees, including the bench, to undergo bias training. Even though the courtroom was quiet, Mrs. Thompson's energy filled the air. She resumed typing, determined to record every word of this conversation. The BFF nodded slightly, acknowledging that she had seen it. There were many similar cases where these ideas were not questioned. Judge Barrett began attempting to regain control, a move that, despite his good intentions, appeared overly dramatic for such a straightforward case. "With all due respect to Your Honor," Sarah responded, "What's the matter?" The prevalence of racial bias in our courts is alarming. As a federal prosecutor, I've seen how easy this. When little things add up, they form systemic barriers to justice. She took her wallet out of her briefcase. "I'll pay the fine now, and my office will get in touch about reviewing the court records." She didn't sound frustrated in her voice. There was no anger, just the professional tone of someone who knew how to stand up to injustice. Within the system, the morning sun had risen higher, lighting up the whole thing. Judge Barrett sat in his raised chair in the courtroom, but he didn't look as powerful as he had earlier in the day. Power had shifted, and everyone present understood they were witnessing more than just a moment of personal transformation. The same day marked not only victory, but also the beginning of significant institutional transformation by late afternoon. This is the story of what events that transpired in Judge Barrett's courtroom swiftly disseminated throughout Atlanta's legal community. A text message from the young law student who had seen everything and sent it to her study group. Something amazing happened in municipal court. A federal lawyer showed judges racial bias. As Sarah Collins sat in her government office, she heard something that made her laugh. As she looked over papers for the Thompson trafficking case, her phone started buzzing non-stop. The first calls were from, they wanted to share similar stories about their time working for Judge Barrett with other black lawyers in Atlanta. Some people stayed quiet for years because they feared losing their jobs. This isn't just about. I asked Sarah about her conversation with her co-worker Marcus Johnson, a federal investigator who frequently visited her office to check on each lawyer. Who has to deal with this? Just consider how many ordinary people suffer in silence. She showed him that her phone was getting more and more texts from lawyers all over the city. In the break room of the courtroom, Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk, was talking to other employees. "I've been keeping my own notes." She said she took a small notebook out of her desk drawer every time she saw something that didn't look right. She recorded the dates, names, and locations. Her hands shook a little as she did this. By early evening local time, she told everyone this secret she had hidden for years. Several news outlets picked up the story. A reporter from Channel 5 News, Michael Chen, was stationed outside the building. As the evening show's crew sets up, sources inside the courthouse report that a federal lawyer was. What happened to the $500 fine he claimed he received for arriving late to court this morning? Next has started a talk about racism in our justice system across the whole city. The story quickly went viral on social. The colorblindness of Judge Barrett and the justices became a trend in Atlanta's media. People began to tell the judge about their own stories, and soon a clear pattern emerged. Former inmates posted about their experiences in his courtroom, with many telling similar tales of being treated badly because of their race. That night, Judge Barrett sat at home and watched the news, growing increasingly concerned that his phone had been stolen. He was getting calls all afternoon from other judges on the Judicial Review Board and reporters who wanted to talk to him. After serving as a judge for 30 years, his entire career was now under scrutiny. The phone rang again in Sarah's office. This time it was Sharon Martinez, a well-known civil rights lawyer we've been trying to reach. Sharon said she had been keeping track of these trends for years, but coming from a federal lawyer, especially one who, having seen it for yourself, this changes everything. Would you be willing to talk at a press meeting tomorrow? The staff in the municipal court's filing office had already begun looking up Judge Barrett's past cases, muttered to each other as they looked at the trends in his fines and jail time. One clerk found that in his courtroom last year, black defendants were 3 times more likely than white suspects to get the highest fine for nightfall, broke the same rules, and national news outlets have picked up the story. An Atlanta judge faces a closer look was conducted after a federal lawyer read one story about racial bias. The revelation of another courtroom in Georgia sparked discussions about pervasive racism on social media. Sarah's case is a strong example of how the legal system should work. James Wilson received numerous calls that night from other court workers. He told them that he had seen things, and now someone in a position of power had also seen them, did not let it go. He thought of all the times he had seen similar events happen and felt powerless to stop them. Late that night, Sarah sat in her home office and went through the hundreds of legal texts she had gotten. Groups wanted her to talk at their events, and civil rights groups asked her to help them keep records of other cases. Law schools asked her to give guest talks on how to fight structural bias. She logged on to her laptop and started to writing a written report to the Judicial Qualifications Commission, JQC, because this wasn't just about one judge or one no longer a small event. It had grown into something much bigger. A force for change system needed it very badly. As she worked, her phone rang with one more message. It was from a young black law, "Thank you, student, for showing us that we can fight the system from the inside. A week after the event, you've given us hope." Because of this, the State Judicial Qualifications Board began an official investigation into the judge. The big meeting room on the 10th floor of the State Justice Building was busy with people talking about Barrett's case. Investigators looked through thousands of court records from the last 5 years. Linda Martinez was in charge of the investigation. Her team had been working non-stop for 20 years, with dozens of files spread out on the long wooden table. They looked at every case that had been heard in Judge Barrett's hearing and found trends that couldn't have happened. Linda instructed her team to ignore these numbers, pointing to a chart on her laptop in the midst of traffic. Black defendants who broke the law paid an average fine of $450, while white offenders paid $150. Like the other times, she pushed her glasses up inside, and that's just the beginning at the end of the hall. Mrs. Thompson sat uncomfortably with her notebook in a small interview room. For a span of 12 years, she meticulously documented all the negative aspects she observed in the Judge Barrett's courtroom, and now she had the chance to share them. "I saw the pattern during her first year as his clerk," she told the police, her hands shaking a little as she opened her notebook. "He spoke to people in different ways, using different tones, words, and even different amounts of time. They were required to provide explanations for their cases based on their appearance. The study went beyond just the 4 fine records. The team spoke with numerous previous suspects, lawyers, and court officials. Staff James Wilson, the Baith, gave a written statement that listed hundreds of on certain days. James would write about the things he had witnessed during his 15 years of work. He said that he would keep track of how many times the judge cut off black suspects versus white ones. It was shocking that black accused were stopped 5 times more often on average than white defendants. Sarah Collins kept doing her normal job as a prosecutor at the federal courts, but her office had become this is a place where people who want to share their stories can meet. Young lawyers brought in records of their experiences. People in the community wrote down complaints that had been overlooked for years. "We need to sort all this information out," Sarah told her helper as she looked at the growing stack of proof on her desk. Events are crucial to changing the system, not just one judge. The research team found more troubling trends. On average, black women got the biggest fines. It took 40% less time to process calls involving suspects of color. 3 times as many minorities had their payment plans turned down, and character witnesses were stopped more often. When he was speaking on behalf of minority suspects, Judge Barrett frequently faced questions. The session showed more of his hidden biases when he was shown the data, which made him look really shocked. He said, "I've always prided myself on being fair, so I never realized how discriminatory he was." During one interview, his voice was quieter than it is in court. "I never thought that would happen." For the first time, he seemed to understand how his actions were affecting others. The study also uncovered a startling revelation. Several other judges in the area made decisions that followed the same patterns. This led to a review into, by the end of the 3rd courtroom, the actions of one judge revealed a deep-seated issue that affected multiple courtrooms. This week, Linda Martinez and her team put together a detailed report. The 300-page paper was full of the data includes statistics, accounts, and in-depth analyses of tens of thousands of cases. There was a lot of proof, and this report doesn't just show a few events, Lynn said. It shows the Commission Board a pattern of systemic bias that has touched thousands of lives over many years. Years ago, she laid out the lengthy report on the table during the meeting. More importantly, this type of bias operates so covertly that its perpetrators may not fully understand their actions. As the study came to a close, Sarah became very clear about one thing. Collins's experience had unlocked a long-closed door. We need to expose and address the evidence of bias, discrimination, and unfair treatment immediately. There was more at stake than just what would happen to Judge Barrett. There was also the question of how to fix a system that had let such bias happen. Having grown without being stopped for so long, the next steps would require more than just punishment. They would require 3 months after Sarah Collins walked in, their courts completely rethought the way they administered justice. As the sun came up in the morning, it changed the look of justice in Atlanta. Judge Barrett's courtroom was one of them. Workers put up windows in the main courthouse while they built a new science center for legal education and equality training. After the probe was over, Judge Barrett was no longer on the bench. He was given the option to retire or face although he retired after the public hearing, his story continued. Unexpectedly, he took on a new role. Judge Barrett answered, "I never saw my own bias," to a group of judges. During the first required training practice, he stood at the platform and didn't look like the man he had been before. Sarah Collins, I thought his voice was more humble and his stance less stiff. Just because I thought it was fair to treat everyone the same, I never thought about how my own past and ideas affected what I thought was fair. Sarah sat in the back of the training room and watched what was happening. She hadn't seen this coming. When she stood up in that courtroom 3 months ago, Mrs. Thompson, a former court clerk, was sitting next to her. Was put in charge of a new program to keep an eye on the courts. The changes extended beyond a single courthouse and introduced new rules. All courts were required to maintain comprehensive records of all fines, punishments, and court cases. Conduct. These records were now looked at once a month by a separate group made up of people from the community, lawyers, and legal experts. The organization advocates for human rights and freedom of speech. James Wilson was selected to lead judges of the eyes and ears of the courtroom, he told his first group of students in a new training program. Our teens should speak up when they see unfair treatment. The days of being quiet are over in her federal prosecutor's office. Sarah looked at the wall where she had hung a frame with her $500 fine ticket. It had become a sign of change for her, A new sign below it told everyone who came into her office that one person's stand could make a difference. This is a picture of her with a group of law students whose class she taught every week on legal ethics and bias. In its first year, the local bar group set up a new way for lawyers to report cases of bias. The system receives over 200 reports each month, and it meticulously examines each one to provide a comprehensive understanding. Sarah said that it's not just about punishing unacceptable behavior. It's also about figuring out where problems were and how to fix them. It's about changing the way we think about justice for everyone who walks into a courtroom. We should treat everyone in the courts with respect, regardless of their race, gender, or background. The changes weren't made. It wasn't just Atlanta that started making required bias changes. Other towns did too. We should regularly check judge choices for racial bias and provide training to all court staff. Groups will look over how the courts work and come up with new rules for making fines and sentences more consistent. One morning, precisely 3 months following Sarah's rape, law students were required to undergo diversity training. It was a letter from a young law student who had seen everything happen in court that day. You demonstrated to me how that incident altered her career trajectory, shifting her focus to civil rights law. The letter stated that change is possible. Sometimes all it takes is one person to say this isn't true. Indeed, the student established a legal center at her law school to assist older individuals facing discrimination in court. That day, a black man who had been in court came back to see the building. He walked slowly through the halls and looked at all the changes, include new signs in more than one language to welcome people and a help desk. The security guard smiled and greeted everyone the same. "I've been coming here for a while now." Having worked at the courts for 40 years, he told a young worker at the help desk, "This is the first time I felt," while tears filled his eyes. When Sarah's phone rang, it was a message from the Judicial Review Board telling her to go to a certain place. While reading the message, she thought back to that morning 3 months ago for a brief moment. Going against the grain had set off a wave of change that was still growing in the main courthouse lobby. Someone had erected a new sign reading, "Justice is not just the law. It's about how we treat everyone who comes through these doors." Sarah Collins was born on this day. I went into Judge Barrett's courtroom and made a big difference.